Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and online viewers worldwide. Welcome to the 2024 Tang Prize Masters Forum in Rule of Law. Soochow University is very privileged and honored to host and to welcome all to this important forum on the topic of contemporary challenges on human rights and global justice. We are holding this special event in a concert hall because Soochow University is famed for her music department and the many renowned musicians on her faculty. To show our utmost hospitality, we'd like to present music performance as the prelude to this most significant event by having the most famous musician whose voice can be heard almost every evening on radio. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you Dr. Peng Guangling and his outstanding colleagues and students. The first violinist was none other than Dr. Peng Guangling himself. And the three young musicians are Dr. Peng's colleague and former students. The second violinist, Mr. Lin Ziyuan. On viola, Ms. Hong Yunqing. And on cello, Professor Hou Rouan. And today, the well-known piece, You Raise Me Up, has been arranged for string quartet by Mr. Zheng Bawei. Ladies and gentlemen, Soochow's very own string quartet from the music department. Thank you very much for the wonderful music. May I also give you a note on Dr. Peng Guangling himself. In addition to being a famous musician in Taiwan, Dr. Peng Guangling is also the mastermind in the designing and construction of this music hall. He was very particular in the acoustic and the sound effect of the equipment, making sure that every single note will resonate throughout the hall. He can cite measures about the length, the width, the depth of the stage. He can even tell you how many seats there are in this music hall. To officiate the opening of this special event, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of inviting the president of Soochow University, Dr. Zhan Qianlong, to give his welcoming remarks. Please join me in giving Dr. Zhan Qianlong a big round of applause.
Your Excellency, Professor Mary Robinson, distinguished guests, honorable members of the Tang Prize Foundation, esteemed scholar, and dear student, good afternoon. Today, we are deeply honored to welcome Professor Mary Robinson, a globally renowned advocate for human rights and justice. As a former president of Ireland and a pioneer in the field of human rights, the rule of law, and inspiration to countless people around the world, it is a true privilege to have her with us today. First, I would like to express our sincere gratitude and deep respect to you, Professor Robinson. Your unwavering commitment to promoting human rights and justice has had an immeasurable impact, whether during your time as a United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights or in your later effort to tackle the social inequality brought about by global climate change. Your courageous leadership and visionary insight have shaped the lives of many. We are all eagerly looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the contemporary challenge in human rights and global justice. Your wisdom will undoubtedly inspire us all. I also extend my heartfelt thanks to the Tang Prize Foundation for their support, which has made today's forum possible. The Tang Prize Rule of Law Award not only recognize outstanding contribution to the legal field worldwide, but also provide encouragement and motivation for individuals striving to promote the rule of law and protect human rights globally. As a Soochow University with a deep-rooted tradition in legal study, we have long embraced the responsibility of advancing legal education and the human rights. We believe that the study of law extends beyond theoretical discussion. It is about fostering students with a global perspective who can make a meaningful contribution to the world, human rights, and the justice issue. Today's forum amplifies our commitment to the mission. We will hold this event in the beautiful Songyi Council Hall, also named after the donor Suzhou's very own chair professor, Dr. Tang and his wife, Mrs. Tang. Yeah. Thank you for giving us such a beautiful place to enjoy today's speech and the panel discussion. Once again, I extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Mary Robinson for being with us and for your tireless effort in the pursuit of human rights and global justice. Your contribution will undoubtedly inspire us all, encouraging more people to join this noble cause. I would also like to thank all our distinguished guests and scholars in attendance. And I hope that today's forum will sparkle new ideas and reflection, leading us toward a better future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please take your seat and join our distinguished guests and everyone in the audience for a group photo. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are having our photographers on the stage. Please give our photographers a big smile. If you want, you can say cheese. Or give our photographer a thumbs up. Thank you very much. That was beautiful. Now I would like to invite onto stage the moderator for today's forum, Liberal Arts Chair Professor of Soochow University, Professor Huang Mo, to please Professor Huang Mo, as the moderator, will be giving us an introduction of our speaker today, Her Excellency, Professor Mary Robinson. Professor Huang, please.
Mr. President Chan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate indeed to have this rare opportunity to hear Professor Mary Robinson discourse on law and global justice. In her long career in teaching, in law, in public service, as well as in the private sector, our Tang Prize laureate has done much to make our world a better place to live. She was a prominent constitutional law professor at Trinity College, Dublin. And at a very young age of 25, she was elected to the Senate and then the presidency of Ireland. In her position as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, she expanded her vision and horizon and took the whole world into her care. In so many fields, in women's rights, in protecting the environment, and in the promotion of human rights, justice, and peace. Professor Mary Robinson has left her mark. We shall all be grateful to her. As for us living in Taiwan, it would be mistaken if you think she did not touch our life. Our effort to set up a National Human Rights Commission, which has taken us more than 20 years to achieve, were inspired by her dedication and tireless work to encourage and to assist all nations to move to establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principle. And we have done that. Now, it's my great honor and pleasure to present to you our Tang Prize laureate and the most distinguished former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Mary Robinson.
Could I begin by thanking for that beautiful music at the beginning in this lovely concert hall, a wonderful version of Raise Me Up. I felt uplifted, which is very helpful when I have the challenge of giving this master's opening and knowing there is a very distinguished panel which will join me very shortly. I've been asked to speak on a number of contemporary challenges on human rights and global justice. And I will begin with gender equality. I had to think about gender equality very early in my life because I was the only girl wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So of course I had to think about gender equality, human rights, even using my elbows. And my parents were medical doctors, and they assured me that I had exactly the same rights and exactly the same opportunities as my 4 brothers. But Irish society at the time was not telling me that. The woman's place was in the home. It was in our constitution. And there was no sense of equality in Ireland at the time. And I think that's what brought me to want to study law. I wanted to study law as an instrument for social justice. That was my sole reason for wanting to study law. And after 4 years in Trinity, in the honours course in legal science, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to the Harvard Law School. And I remember very vividly that year, 1967 to 68. I'm the class of 1968. It was a particular year. My American law student contemporaries were worried about an immoral war, as they saw it, the war in Vietnam. And some of them were actually trying to dodge the draft. And in April, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and just after I graduated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. At the time, those were 2 horrendous and notable assassinations because it wasn't, I think, like today when we have so much violence that issues like that don't have the same resonance. But what I recalled from that year in Harvard was that my young friends and other students were taking leadership. They were actually trying to make a difference. They were going into the civil rights program or the poverty program in the southern part of the United States. And that was so different from the Ireland that I was growing up in. Because in Ireland, you waited, and you waited your turn, and you waited. And if you were a woman, you didn't have much turn to wait for. And so when I came back to Ireland and started to practice law in 1968, there was an election in early 1969 of the two houses of our parliament. And in our Senate, which has 60 members, there are 6 university seats. And traditionally and inevitably, it was elderly male professors who would get those 6 seats. And because of my experience in Harvard, and actually what my husband Nick, or husband-to-be Nick, called my Harvard humility, he meant the opposite. Not humility, but somehow a kind of willingness to take on and change things. I challenged the system and got the support to be elected to the Senate at the age of 25. And the reason I recount that is because it opened up further opportunities for me. I had also, in 1969, become the Reed Professor of Constitutional and Criminal Law in Trinity College. It's a trust that established the professorship for a practicing young lawyer. So you had the title professor and a very poor salary, so it wasn't a real professorship in every sense, but it was nonetheless a professorship. And that meant I was teaching law as a professor, I was practicing law as an advocate, as a lawyer, as a barrister, and I was helping to make some law in the Senate. And I was trying to use all three to further gender equality, human rights, and open up Irish society. And so I want, in particular, just to take a moment or two to talk about the gender equality part of that. In 1971, I introduced a bill into the Parliament, into the Senate, to legalise family planning in Ireland. The law was thought to be very much, the law at the time was that married women could only avail of the contraceptive pill if they had the written permission of their doctor that they had cycle regulation problems. And I remember we used to joke as women that it must have been the Irish weather that so many women had cycle regulation problems, trying to get access to contraceptives. But also, it was against the law to buy or sell a condom, and it was not against the law to use it, but just to buy or sell. And there was a lot of discussion among young people, but Ireland was a very conservative country. And when I introduced this bill on family planning, I suddenly changed from being a somewhat popular figure because I had been elected to the Senate at a young age, to a very, very unpopular figure. I got hate mail, hate letters. It was the time, obviously, before social media, but those hate letters were very painful. I was being called a witch from hell, and I was being told that I was undermining all the morals in Ireland, and this was a terrible thing to do. And they were very rough letters, tough letters. And I actually had been affected by those letters, so my husband decided to burn them, or we decided together. And actually we regretted it afterwards because we are natural archivists, and we regret the loss of that indication of the views and the opinion at that time about reproductive health and rights and family planning. And the members of the Senate didn't want to give approval to the bill being published. So it is the only example so far in Irish legislative history that a measure put forward by a senator, and with the help of 2 male senators, you have to have 3 to support a bill, did not get published as a document of the Senate. Of course, everybody knew what was in it. It was in all the newspapers, it was written up, it was criticized, it was approved by some, but it was not official. They just would not do it. In fact, one senator came in with white gloves, would not touch the order paper that had this. I mean, you cannot even know how strong the adverse opinion was in this very Catholic Ireland of the time. And we persisted. In 1973, we had switched the subject to health. So we moved it from a criminal law bill to being a health family planning bill in 1973. And that actually got printed and got a second reading. And we withdrew it because the government of the day said they would bring in legislation on family planning. And when they did, half the cabinet voted against it, and that bill didn't succeed. So it took another 7 years for a different government to actually change the law. So 9 years, more than 9 years in all, to get that law changed. I also recall working with some other senators on other measures like removing the status of illegitimacy for children. Under our law, children born outside marriage were regarded as illegitimate, and we felt this was a wrong word entirely for a human being. And so we again, when we put forward the bill, we withdrew it in favor of a government bill, which did come in much more quickly. And there were many other examples of discriminations. I remember a very good friend of mine, a poet called Evan Boland, a very good Irish poet who died, sadly, a year or two ago, and she was a very close friend. She was a member of the Women's Liberation Movement. I wasn't a member of the Women's Liberation Movement, but I was their lawyer. You know, I would help them with cases or any problems or give them advice. And she came to me and she said, or she rang me, and she said, "I'm going to a meeting. Can you give me 7 laws that discriminate against women?" And I said, "Evan, why only 7? I can give you more." "Oh, no, 7's a good number." And that's all I could remember. You know? But that again gives you an idea that we were not short of laws. One of the ones, and I'll come back to the case, was about women not being able to serve on juries. Married women had to retire from the civil service if they became married. There were a whole lot of legislative discriminations. But it was important to be able to raise these issues and try to bring in legislation that would change the law. But perhaps the cases that I was involved in the courts were more impactful in the sense that it was possible to have more success. Let me put it that way. It was possible to win more cases. And I recall in particular the cases that made a difference not just for the individual applicant, but for a whole range of people. And they're the ones that I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about. A case that I particularly enjoyed working on started without me. It started with the client herself. Josie Airy was a poor woman from a city in the south of Ireland called Cork. Her husband was beating her. There was no divorce in Ireland. She had already got an order from the lowest court to stop the beating, but it didn't stop. So she wanted to get a separation. No divorce, just a separation. But to do that, she would have to go into the High Court. And the High Court was complex. So she went to lawyers, she tried. No lawyer would take her because she was very poor. She couldn't afford to pay. So she wrote a letter to a body she had heard of in the newspapers called the European Commission on Human Rights. And the letter was full of irrelevance, but there was something in that letter. And the lawyers in the Commission on Human Rights said, I think we will send this to the Irish government and see what they say. So they sent the letter to the government, and the government, of course, said there is no barrier to a woman going in as an individual plaintiff. She can go into court. And the lawyers of the Commission were not entirely satisfied that was, they felt anybody can walk into the Ritz Hotel, but can they afford to, it's one thing to say it's accessible, but what if it's complicated and procedural and difficult, which of course the High Court was. So the Commission on Human Rights provided legal aid to Josie Airy, and that's where I became involved as a barrister. And it was an extraordinary pleasure in many ways to plead her case and to show that this was contrary to Article 8 of the European Convention, protection of family life. And the reason why I was so excited about it was clear to me that the outcome would mean that Ireland would have to bring in civil legal aid. And there had been a lot of efforts of various sorts, but it was that case that required the Irish government to bring in civil legal aid. And actually, because it was a case of a European court, it meant that other European countries should also consider bringing in civil legal aid. And I mentioned the question of juries, and perhaps because that's a case that was resolved in the Irish courts, I'll just mention it because there's an interesting new judge appeared on the hearing before the Supreme Court. I brought the case involved two women who had been accused of a minor crime that allowed a jury trial, but they did not want a trial with only men, and women were barred from the jury. And as we were researching and arguing the case, we were aware that in the United States, exactly the same issue was being argued before the federal Supreme Court in the United States. And just before this case called De Burca and Anderson against Ireland came for hearing before the Supreme Court, it was decided favorably in the United States. The United States Federal Supreme Court decided that women could not be discriminated against and refused to be able to serve on juries. And when we came in to the Supreme Court to plead this case, the Chief Justice of the United States sat in the court. He was invited, he was visiting Ireland, and he was very intrigued to know about the same, and they just invited him to sit in for the morning, which was very unusual. And it's just a memory of how sometimes jurisdictions can help each other, very different jurisdictions. And we did succeed in the Supreme Court in Ireland. And I just want to mention the last case that I pleaded in court, because it was a very impactful case for poor women in Ireland. Our social welfare code was based on the husband, the man, and everything flowed from that. So when married women got unemployment benefit, it was less than a man would get, and for a shorter period. And so two women, Mrs. Cotter and Mrs. McDermott, wanted to litigate that. And we succeeded in, well, first of all, when we went to the High Court, the president of the High Court at the time felt that there was some merit in our case, but it was because of European legislation. And he said, I'm not going to decide that myself. I'm going to refer it to the court in Luxembourg for a definitive ruling on whether the directive on equal pay and equal opportunity of the European Union was directly applicable in Ireland and allowed Mrs. Cotter and Mrs. McDermott to have the standing to plead it. And so the President of the High Court referred the case to the European Court, and I argued that case before the European Court, and the European Court gave a very strong ruling in our favour, very strong ruling. And it went back to the High Court for decision. And the High Court President understood the implications of giving it the full implementation that Mrs. Cotter and Mrs. McDermott had been discriminated against in their social welfare benefit, unemployment benefit, and he kind of gave a partial judgment that as of the future, this would apply. But he was not prepared to consider, in their case, back payment, what they had lost in not getting the maternity, the unemployment benefit, because he was aware there were actually hundreds, if not thousands, of similar married women who had been discriminated against over the years, and therefore, so he made a ruling that it would only apply as of the future. And we were not happy with that, because the court ruling of the European Court had been much broader than that and hadn't implied only for the future. So we appealed to the Irish Supreme Court, and the Irish Supreme Court decided to go back to Europe. And meanwhile, I was nominated to be a candidate for the presidency. So I had stopped practicing law. And then this case came up for hearing in October of 1990, and the election was in November. And I said, but I have to do it. It's so complicated. Nobody else can come in now and take this forward. I need to go for my clients. And I remember, saying, do you want to win or do you want to go back to law? I mean, make up your mind. And I said, look, just let me do this one case. So I went back to the Supreme Court, to the Court of Human Rights, Court of the European Union in Luxembourg, and made the case that their initial ruling, had clearly implied that it should be retrospective, that the women should be able to get their money. And the court reserved their judgment and mentioned when the Advocate General would give a ruling, which is what happens in the court in Luxembourg, as I'm sure some of you would know. And they said, they sort of, the lead justice in the court said, this may or may not be of interest to you, Mrs. Robinson, meaning either you'll be president or you'll still be doing law. And actually, by the time the ruling came, I was elected president, so I didn't go back. I didn't hear I heard the final verdict and was pleased, but I wasn't in court. That cost the Irish Exchequer some £300,000 at the time. So it was a very significant case for gender equality for women. And it was, I was trying to use it as an illustration. It's lovely when you can take a case for individual clients that will affect a whole sector, that will affect someone in a broader sense. The second way in which, the third way in which I tried to support gender equality was through my participation in public life, basically. I always promoted the importance of gender balance and gender equality in speeches that I made, including going forward for election a number of times over those 20 years. And I had an incident which did annoy me because it was discrimination outside Ireland in something I was involved in and surprised me. It happened in Belgium, in Brussels. In 1971, I was invited as the only woman to serve on the Vidal Committee on Enlargement of the European Parliament. And this committee had members of the 6 original European Union members, European Community members as it was then, and then the 4 members, 4 applicant members, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, and Norway. Norway eventually voted against joining, so you had 3 new members. But we were looking at what impact this would have on the European institutions. So it was a serious piece of work, and it was recognized that we would have to go back and forth to Brussels. So they decided that in order to give us our expenses of travel and our per diem, if you like, because we weren't, there was no salary involved, that we could open a bank account, and they gave a choice. And when they came to me, they said, "Oh, but you're a married woman." And I said, "Yes." "What's that?" They said, "Oh, you need the written permission of your husband in Belgium to open a bank account." I said, "What?" Because this did not apply in Ireland. Of course, my wicked husband was only delighted to hear all this, and was. But anyway, I became Ms. Robinson for once, and blurred the idea that I was married, and all was well. But I think what I want to illustrate is, there were so many forms of discrimination. It wasn't that surprising that another country would require the written permission. And by the time I was going forward as the candidate of the Labour Party, but running as an independent in 1990 for election, I was very much part of a broader women's movement in Ireland. And that women's movement was significant because as the campaign went on, when I started, I was very much an outsider, 100 to 1 outsider, because it was assumed that the party that had always had the presidency would have it. The deputy prime minister was running. He was a shoo-in, as we would say in Ireland. He was a certainty. But gradually, because I had more time, I made the case, and the case became more popular. And I was aware that I was gaining ground, if you like. And it was the women's movement that made all the difference. And not just the women's movement in that progressive sense, but a lot of women who were quite conservative, quite sort of maybe didn't have careers outside their home, quietly decided to vote differently from their husband for the first time, or differently from their father. And I heard so many stories. I heard a story of a young woman some years later, and the way she put it summed it all up. She said, "I want to shake your hand," she said to me. "You were my first vote. And when I told my father how I voted for you, and when I told my father, he nearly killed me." So that was what was that. So when I was accepting the nomination, I mean, it was the night I was elected, but not the inauguration. I thanked Mná na hÉireann, which means women of Ireland, in a pejorative way. Up to then, there was a way of describing women who weren't active in life, who weren't part of the progressive women's movement, who were housewives, who stayed at home. But I was valuing what they had done, and they understood that perfectly. And it kind of helped me as president to broaden the whole sense of gender equality, just by lifting Mná na hÉireann. I thanked Mná na hÉireann, who instead of rocking the cradle, rocked the system. And, it kind of made it easier to have a broader, more sort of integrated sense of gender equality. It wasn't just women who were lawyers or journalists or trade unionists or, had careers, businesswomen. It was all women in Ireland felt part of this gender equality. And I made it very clear that I was determined as president to feel that I would do a better job precisely because I was a woman. I was absolutely determined to convey that at all stages. And, that was because I felt I had been fortunate enough to get the confidence of women that had helped me to get elected. Of course, it was a universal election, so men also elected me, I'm glad to say, but women changing their vote from the traditional voting was a significant part. And now I come to human rights protection in that sense. And I'd like to just reflect on when, after the 7 years as President of Ireland, on the same day, the 12th of September of 1997, I became the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I found that my horizon had to broaden really significantly. Up to then, it was Ireland and Europe was very helpful to Ireland. The European Court of Human Rights, the European Union Court was helping Ireland to open up and make progress. Now, I could be asked questions at press conferences about countries or cities or human rights problems somewhere in the world that I hardly even knew about. You know, that kind of strange burden of knowing that you were responsible for human rights throughout the world. And even more significantly, I think, before I became UN High Commissioner, Kofi Annan, who had become Secretary General in January of that year, he had his 1997 reform package. The UN is always reforming itself, or should be. Anyway, this 1997 reform package made the office, the new office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the only one to be part of the 4 executive committees of the UN, the Executive Committee on Peace, on Development, on Humanitarian issues, and on economic and social issues. And it was a way of affirming the holistic notion of human rights, that they were economic and social rights, civil and political rights, and also not Western, Eastern, Northern, or Southern. They were universal. And we had a small office that was tasked with somehow implementing this. And I remember having a conversation with Kofi Annan early enough on, and I said, you know, I do understand the significance of you making my office part of the, what had you in mind? And he smiled and he said, no, Mary, that's for you to figure out. So, you know, it was a case of really trying to work with the way in which the UN worked, the treaty bodies, the work of the rapporteurs. All of them were underfunded, all of them were complaining at the time. One of the things I had to do was try to raise extra budgetary funds to help the office. But I saw the need to embed human rights in the culture of countries, and I strongly supported the emerging national human rights commissions with their Paris principles that you've just heard from our wonderful moderator. You have, and I in my speech on rule of law, I referred to the fact that Taiwan had established its own National Human Rights Commission. I didn't know it took 20 years, but I'm very pleased that it is one of the National Human Rights Commissions and that it abides by the Paris principles. I attended quite a number of the regional meetings of National Human Rights Commissions, and I felt that this was an important way of really embedding in the culture of countries. Obviously, governments do have the main responsibility to protect human rights, but it's also extremely important to have vibrant civil society organizations and individual champions. And I must say, like many of you, I would say, I'm very worried about the shrinking of civil society space in so many countries. We keep hearing this, great complaints from human rights defenders. It's much tougher now, and I'm sure we will want to talk about this a bit. And anyone who protests suddenly finds themselves characterized as a terrorist. The awful problem of the overuse of the word terrorism since the terrible attacks in the United States of 9/11 and I want to speak a bit about business and human rights, because I had a very interesting evolution in my own thinking on business and human rights, because there was a small unit in the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights dealing with business. And the way in which the office, the unit, dealt with business was that business was, by definition, bad. Business was violating and abusing human rights. And I felt I'm sure, and I know, yes, there are many cases where that is true. Mining companies, not respecting the land or water rights and lots of other things. But, that seems a bit narrow. And I was part of the support for the Global Compact on Business and Human Rights, which Kofi Annan launched in 1999. And I was very pleased that human rights were the first two principles of the Global Compact, then labor rights and environmental rights. And it allowed a recognition that business can also be on the right side of issues of human rights. And I became the founding chair of the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and I know that the Institute has worked here in Taiwan on human rights issues. I mentioned that in my laureate address. And I'm also linked to another very good large website and human rights activists in the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. They are competitive friends, I would say. They both do very good work on human rights. And the Business and Human Rights Resource Center inaugurated a Mary Robinson speaker series 15 years ago. We had our 15th speaker series just before the UN General Assembly. In the last few years since COVID, it has been done virtually, which means you can reach a much larger audience. And what they do is they bring human rights activists from ground level, but also business leaders on the right side of the thing. So it's a very good way of showing the different ways in which business is supportive or may not be supportive of human rights, and the importance of the guidelines on business and human rights, etc. And I turn now to global justice and local content, which is the next section I was invited to speak about. And this is where I very much want to emphasize the importance of a climate justice approach to the climate and nature crisis. I say that with some humility because actually I came very late to the climate change crisis. During my 7 years as President of Ireland, I spoke about the environment, but I didn't mention climate change because we weren't aware. Yes, I'm sure there were Irish scientists, climate scientists, who probably were writing theses about it, but the general population and their president, we were not aware of what was happening elsewhere. And then I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I became aware of the importance of climate change, but there was another part of the UN dealing with it, and I didn't connect it to my large portfolio in the UN of human rights, gender equality, rights of indigenous peoples, rights of people with disabilities. I didn't make the connection. It was immediately afterwards, in 2002, 2003, 2004, I had already established a small NGO called Realizing Rights, working in African countries, mainly on economic and social rights. And it was so clear at that time, 2003 in particular, and 2004 and on, the impact was palpable. Women would say to me, "Is God punishing us? What is happening? We don't understand. The rainy seasons don't come. We have long periods of drought and then flash flooding that's destroyed the school. This is outside our experience. What is happening?" Complete, not knowing, but knowing that this was not what the village lore knew over 200 years. When they say outside our experience, that's what they mean. Grandparent to grandchild to it would be at least 200 years. Something was happening. And because most of them were farmers, I remember sitting at a hearing with Archbishop Tutu as elders for Oxfam just before the conference in Copenhagen in 2009. We sat and listened to 5 African farmers. 4 of them were women, and each of them had a devastating story to tell. So the impacts were so much worse, and that's part of climate justice. I mean, I identify layers of climate justice. The worst thing is that the climate and nature impacts affect the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island developing states, and the indigenous peoples much earlier and much more severely than more developed parts of the world. Secondly, within that, women suffer much more devastatingly because they are the farmers, because they have to go and get the water, and if there's drought, etc. And if there's a heavy typhoon, flooding or whatever, they have long skirts, they hold their babies, and they die. And we know from figures much more women and children die in climate disasters than men. So from so many points of view, and then women are building resilience on the ground, but they don't get the climate funding. The climate funding doesn't reach the grassroots level. I believe that it will be better for our sense of the urgency of climate if we make it more people-centered in dealing with it. And this is more difficult now because of the geopolitical divides and the emergence of a multipolar world, which is posing challenges to the fundamental values of human rights as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, autocratic governments and populism pose threats, as does the overuse of branding protesters, including now even climate protesters, as terrorists, since the terrible attacks in the United States of 9/11. Those divides have affected the work of the United Nations, as we know. In fact, it was an illustration of that during the Summit of the Future, which I attended just before coming here, for the first time ever, there was a summit of heads of state where there was actually voting. Usually, when it's a summit of heads of state, it's all agreed beforehand. They come as heads of state to speak, but the work is done. That's the way the UN always worked. This time, there could not be final agreement. Russia objected, and 4 or 5 countries supported Russia in objecting. The UN, in these summits, in resolutions on the summit, it's by consensus. So consensus shouldn't mean everybody, but actually it does mean you cannot have, certainly a large country like Russia objecting, you cannot have agreement. How to resolve this? Unfortunately, Uganda was prompted to put forward a procedural motion not to allow the Russian resolution to go to a vote. And the procedural motion could be voted on by majority. So a large majority, all except about 7, voted in favor of the procedural motion that the Russian resolution should not be put. And you could feel the tension in the room when the President of the General Assembly said, "And I now put the resolution to adopt the Pact of the Future." Bang! He put the gavel down so fast because nobody objected. It was, now this is new. This just is an indication of how significant the shifts are and how difficult it's going to be to get consensus. And I think I should say a brief word about the way in which we live in a world dominated by social media, which again has power for good, but also a very dark side. And I think the impact on young people of social media is something we need to think about very seriously, because I think we're allowing too much bullying and mental health problems, etc., of young people, because we haven't got proper constraints on what can be used in. And we faced attacks on truth. We faced denial, for example, of results of elections and misinformation at a serious level. And these are all aggravated by the impact of generative AI. So that's another issue. And I should have mentioned when I was talking about business and human rights, because I'm sure we'll want to discuss it, the backsliding now on ESR, on economic, social, and ESG, sorry, economic, social, and governance issues, which corporations had been adopting, and good corporations are still adopting, but the pushback is very heavy, especially in the United States. There are states in the United States now which are forbidding corporations to promote economic, social, and environmental factors in their business. And then also the diversity and inclusion is under threat. So let me close my remarks, and we'll get to the panel discussion by referring to what the elders are trying to do in this difficult and fractured world. Since I'm now currently chair of the elders, we have been promoting, and I said this in my laureate speech, long view leadership. But what I wanted to say here in this Masters forum, that we've actually amended our way of talking about the long view leadership as a result of an intergenerational meeting which we held in New York during the UN General Assembly week. We had young leaders discussing with us the existential threats that the elders focus on. We have three major existential threats: the climate and nature crisis, the nuclear weapons crisis, and the pandemic crisis, because we still haven't learned the lessons of COVID. We're still not ready for the next global pandemic. And then across all those, there is the potential, either for good or for bad, of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence. And so, you know, we have been putting forward our ideas. We have said, think beyond short-term political cycles and deliver solutions for both current and future generations. Recognize that enduring answers require compromise and collaboration for the good of the whole world. Show compassion for all people, designing sustainable policies which respect that everyone is born free and equal in dignity and rights. Uphold the international rule of law and accept that durable agreements require transparency and accountability. And finally, in our long view, as we were putting it forward, commit to a vision of hope in humanity's shared future, not play to its divided past. So this is the way we were messaging our long view. But we heard such strong messaging from the younger generation of leaders that we needed to understand that young people now want to be involved in decision-making. They want to be at the table, they want to participate, they want to be involved in what they called co-creation. And so we have decided as elders that we will now message that we should commit to long view leadership, and as well as that, co-creation between generations in coming to consensus on, especially on global issues. And this was one of the very positive elements that came out of the Pact of the Future. It has, for the first time, really recognized that young people need to be involved in decision-making. And there are lots of hooks in the Pact for the Future that reflect this. And I must say, because the elders have been involved in intergenerational discussions a lot in recent years, we were open to the idea of co-creation. We were open to, building this into our messaging. And it reminds me in a way of a saying of Kofi Annan's, which I heard him use when we were together on his last mission in 2018. In July of 2018, we went together to Zimbabwe to promote a peaceful election there, to try to help promote it. And Kofi, again, would repeat a message that he would use a lot. You are never too young to lead, and you are never too old to learn. So what we were illustrating as elders, we were not too old to modify our long view leadership and bring in the co-creation of younger generations. And now I hope I haven't spoken for too long, but I look forward very much to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson. As you sit on the sofa on stage, I will have Professor Wang Mo join you momentarily. So, Professor Wang Mo, would you please, you will be our moderator for today for the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Professor Wang Mo on stage again. I would also like to present to you the discussants for this panel discussion. First of all, President of Taiwan Bar Association, Attorney Yu Mei律师长. Chair Professor of National Taiwan University, Professor Yue Junrong 教授. Last but not least, Special Senior Counsel of D&D, Attorneys at Law, Professor Nigel Lee 李律师. And I will now give the floor to Professor Huang. Professor Huang, please.
I will be speaking.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you agree with me that we could not assemble a more illustrious panelists for this forum. We have three well-known attorneys at law and professors. First, we go to Professor Nigel Lee. I will briefly introduce him. Professor Nigel Lee is an adjunct professor of law at our university here, Suzhou University, and at the Graduate Institute of Political Science at the National Taiwan University. As a practicing attorney at law, he specialized in dispute resolution and arbitration, media law, human and civil rights, international litigation and constitutional law, and has been a chairman from 2007 to 2014, and the honorable chairman since 2014 of the Chinese Arbitration Association Taipei. Over the years, he has dedicated himself to pro bono work. He has served as president of the Taipei Bar Association and sat on the board of Judicial Reform Foundation. His determination to promote human rights and justice has led to his involvement in numerous cases applying for the grand justice interpretation of the Constitution, and his appointment some years ago as a member of the Presidential Advisory Committee on Human Rights. Now, Professor Nigel Lee.
Thank you, Professor Huang. Professor Professor Robinson, distinguished guests, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to extend my congratulations to Professor Robinson for the honor of receiving the Tang Prize of Rule of Law. I enjoyed and have been benefited greatly from the 3 speeches you made in Taiwan. Today, you have referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, and pointed out that the fundamental values set out thereby are now facing new challenges in the nowadays multipolar world. When UDHR was first discussed and designed back in 1948, one of the vice chairs of its drafting meetings, P.C. Tang, was a delegate from the Republic of China that later moved its government to Taiwan. The issues about judicial enforcement of human rights in the international arena were once studied, but without concrete results. With P.C. Tang's suggestion, these issues were then shelved pending the next stage of making the UDHR a legal binding norm, further to the first stage of adopting it as a declaration only. But the same issues did not gain any mileage when the 2 UN covenants, namely ICCPR and ICESCR, were adopted in 1966 and have become effective since 1976. Today, they are still entities, international entities, who are supposed to but not willing to. And they are willing parties who cannot join the covenants. In the year of 2008, Taiwan, the same old Republic China, with a smaller size of territories, ratified and by statute incorporated 2 covenants into the domestic legal order. But the depository was rejected by the UN for political reasons, nothing to do with human rights protection. Back to the implementation issues. Until today, individual victims and many international entities, including such as Rohingyas and others, do not enjoy legal standing in the ICJ to defend their human rights from serious encroachment by their own governments or foreign governments. On the other hand, 20-some years after the 2 covenants became law, Rome Statute was adopted. Although Rome Statute has successfully established in the ICC court since, but it is not a human rights forum per se. Some major players are again not party states thereto. So, Professor Robinson, would you please shed some light upon feasible ways to enlist support from major powerful players within the global village to join party to important international treaties, such as the 2 UN covenants and other fundamental human rights treaties, or even other important norms such as Rome Statute or UNCLOS, and so forth? That's my first question. I have another question in mind. Gladly, rights to environment are gradually gaining wider recognition as a new branch of fundamental human rights. But rights are rights only if remedy is available. Ubi jus, ibi remedium. Voluntary compliance is extremely important to rule of law. But voluntary compliance cannot be all the rule of law has, or particularly the international rule of law. Professor Robinson, could you please share some thoughts about prospects of creating legal mechanism in international forum to extend direct remedies to individual human rights victims for, say, environmental sufferings, so that rights can be rightly right? And international rule of law in its true sense can be established and seen beyond state borders and beyond what we have now as but weak and often ignored international criminal law mechanisms. I look forward to your answers.
Thank you. Sure.
Shall I answer? Yeah, okay. First of all, I agree about the importance of the core covenants, for example, on economic and social rights and on civil and political rights. And I was actually very pleased in my time as my time as High Commissioner for Human Rights, that China signed both covenants and ratified the covenant on economic and social rights, except for, I think it was Article 8 on trade union, on independent trade unions. Jimmy Carter, who of course was an elder and is still an elder emeritus, signed the covenant on economic and social rights, and it has still not been ratified by the United States. And as you say, the United States has not ratified that covenant. I actually regret that in the international human rights, there is a kind of divide between countries totally advocating civil and political rights and considering economic and social rights as somehow aspirations. It undermines the true value of human rights and the integrated approach that I was emphasizing earlier. On the need for victims to have more voice, I was actually, again, the United States has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but I was pleased to know that in New York at the moment there is a very active move to have a special protocol to CEDAW that would allow women to directly raise these issues, and the United States is supportive of that, even though they have not ratified. So in the United States, I think you have two approaches. You often have, if you have a democratic government in particular, an executive and an expertise that very much supports, but a reality of a Congress that is very, very unlikely to pass any of these instruments at the moment. They're so polarized. It's so impossible to consider, sadly, that they would ratify. But, more to the point, it is very sad to see the erosion of respect for international courts. When the International Criminal Court indicted President Putin, there was great support from the United States and from the United Kingdom and from Europe, etc. And the pressure on the prosecutor was coming from Russia. Now, with the seeking warrants to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defense minister, and also the leaders of Hamas, one of whom has now been killed, but still, the outrage, and I mean outrage is the word used, is very shocking, because that is undermining the importance of that court. And then when you take the International Court of Justice with its advisory opinion, a very clear advisory opinion. And the interesting thing about the advisory opinion is it's not new law. It's just restating very clearly and very definitively the law that applies. The occupation is unlawful and must come to an end, etc. Clearly stating obligations of states. And I think it was 38 of the special rapporteurs I think, came out in strong support and calling for what the elders have called for. Stop the military support for, use restraints on military support to rein in what is happening. And that unfortunately has not happened. And, the other case that the South Africa has initiated, I mean, it's very interesting that a country of the South, like South Africa, because of its long history of apartheid, has that moral courage to stand up and say, we are going to bring a case to the court on the genocide issue. And I was actually very proud that one of their chief lawyers was a woman whom I know, very good lawyer, who argued the case. But again, the pressure on that court as well, and the pressure on the prosecutor, and the pressure on South Africa, I know, because they've told me, to drop the case is enormous. And, so we live in a very difficult world where those who are upholding human rights, and both at the international level and at the domestic level, are under more pressure than ever before. So I hope I've contributed to answering your serious questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Robinson. Let's move on, and later probably we have more time to return to this very difficult and complicated issue. We come to Madame Yumeni. I know Madame Yumeni for many, many years. She is the president of the Taiwan Bar Association, has been served with distinction as an attorney at law and a member of the legislative EN 2012 to 2020. She has been and still is a very powerful advocate for gender equality, for women's rights, and LGBT plus, among many other great projects. She has played an important role in many civil society organizations, such as the Awakening Foundation, which aims at heightening women's awareness of their rights. As a lawmaker, she was instrumental in the legalization of the same-sex marriage in 2019, the first in Asia, and in crafting the law establishment, the National Human Rights Commission. Due to her excellent performance in so many fields, she was awarded the National Order of Merit by the government of France in 2020. Now, Madame Yumeni.
I'm sorry, I will speak Mandarin. 我用中文哈。那首先恭贺我们的这个Mary Robinson 教授，那获得了相当于东方的诺贝尔奖的我们的法治奖。那 Robinson 教授呢，这个成长在即使是身为欧洲议会的委员，他仍然需要得到先生的同意，才能够开立账户的那样的一个男女不平等的一个时代。但是无独有偶，虽然晚了10年，但是而且远在几万公里之外的东方台湾， 我们呢仍然同样面临着结婚、怀孕要自动离职，那各种国家考试限男性，婚后呢所有的财产都归先生所有，这样的一个男女不平等的年代。那本人有幸呢，从1982年开始，当时还是戒严时期的时候，能够参与妇女运动。那从性别意识的觉醒，到从下而上的修改法律，那到制度的一个改革，让妇女有机会来参与政治的一个决定。那同时呢，对国际的接轨，将 CEDAW 公约呢内国法化。那一路走来50年呢，可以说是一部不断遇到问题、解决问题的学习、成长和突破的一个生命历程。那台湾妇女运动的开展，就是女性意识的一个觉醒。台湾女性意识的觉醒的萌芽，那要追溯到1970年代的戒严时期。由前副总统吕秀莲，她将妇运的种子带回了台湾。那1976年，她创立了拓荒者出版社，那出版女性主义相关的出版物，并且呢，创设了保护你专线，来保护这些的受暴的妇女。那后来在1979年美丽岛事件的政治事件的时候，吕秀莲被捕入狱。那让这个初刚萌芽的女权运动呢，面临了中断的一个危机。那到了1982年的时候，与吕秀莲呢一起创办保护你专线的李元珍，她创办了妇女新知杂志社，那探讨中华文化5000年的这文化对妇女的影响。那希望能够去武存精，使妇女运动呢能够得以呢延续。该杂志呢，在1984年的时候，妇女节发表了性骚扰知多少的一个问卷调查。那第一次呢，从国外引进了问卷调查跟 sexual harassment 这样的一个名词。那调查的结果有高达84%的妇女朋友都有被性骚扰的经验，那引起很大的震撼。所以呢，媒体呢就把它列为头条新闻，成为国家大事。那这也给妇女新知呢很大的一个启发，可以呢善用每一年的妇女节，那来丢议题，引起呢社会的一个震撼跟省思。那此后呢，我们就看到每一年的妇女节就会有像妇女工作年，探讨为什么妇女到了职场要签切结书，结婚怀孕要自动离职，为什么许多的国家的考试都限男性。那例如家庭主妇年，探讨家庭主妇的财产到底在哪里？为什么结婚了以后，所有财产都归先生所有？那又譬如妇女参政年，宪法规定说妇女参政保障名额1/10，它原来应该是一个最低的门槛，可是为什么它却成为最高的门槛？等等这些的议题呢，在社会上不断的发酵。那接着呢，从私领域到公领域呢，开始着手修改法律，也就在1987年的时候呢，发生了国父纪念馆事件。那国父纪念馆呢，它规定说，女性的员工，你只要结婚、怀孕或是年满30岁，你就要自动离职。但是男性员工却没有这些的规定，所以1987年就有57位的女性的员工都届龄30岁呢，那他们必须要离职。那这些女性员工呢不服，所以他们就请律师发了存证信函给国父纪念馆。国父纪念馆回复说，这些的女性员工都是要当接待员，要接待外宾，介绍中华文物之美，因此必须要仪容端庄。言下之意就是女性只要年满30岁就人老珠黄。所以这样的一个规定呢，当时仍然是这个地下组织的这些妇女团体呢，大家就前往去抗议。但是国父纪念馆呢声称呢，没有人强迫你签切结书，所以是你自己违约，不是我违约，那爱难照办。所以呢，这些女性员工呢，只好又诉诸到上级主管机关教育部。 那当然，教育部呢一查之下发现，不只是国父纪念馆，包括所有的教育部所属的文化机构，包括中正纪念堂、历史博物馆等等，都有这样的一个漏规，所以要求废除。那国父纪念馆呢，他就把它改成1年1聘，所以这些年满30的妇女朋友，她仍然做了1年，明年呢仍然必须要走路。所以原来想要诉讼的解决，但是翻遍6法全书，发现呢找不到任何一个条文可以呢来这个请求。所以呢，因此呢，催生了女性的女权团体呢，开始走上立法的路程，起草了男女工作平等法。那深入去探讨女性在职场上为什么会受到不平等的对待。那最主要就是生儿育女的责任。那生是女人的事情，但是养是谁的责任？它是不是应该是国家社会的责任？那你企业主因为劳动力的再生产，所以你企业主是不是也应该获利而有所谓的社会的责任？那只有把育儿的责任从女性的身上卸下来，女性才有可能在工作职场上跟男性平起平坐。那后来因为这个男女工作平等法的规范呢，就除了平等权以外，另外就规范了这些因为要生产而所引起的这些的成本，包括生理假、产假、陪产假、育婴假、家庭照顾假，都规范在男女工作平等法里面。也因为这些的假增加了雇主的成本，所以引起呢雇主的大反弹。他们上书给当时的总统，声称呢这是企业出走的10大恶法之一。因此呢，男女工作平等法呢从此就被冰冻在立法院，一直到2000年政党轮替之后，然后在2002年呢才完成这样的一个立法。那这个法呢，也就是现在的性别平等工作法。虽然如此，但是这一部法案的它的重要性在于，妇女朋友开始学习如何从婚姻家庭、从私的领域走到公的领域，开始学习如何从立法这样的一个角度去参与国家的政策，也启发了其他的这些的社运团体，纷纷走上自己立法，然后到立法院去游说、沟通，然后最后通过。所以这也成为台湾的到目前为止，所有只要是跟妇女、儿童、身障、原住民，所有这些弱势有关的这些法案呢，全部都是由民间团体自己立法，然后送到立法院游说通过。所以台湾在1987年解严之后，那解严之后的台湾 NGO 百花齐放，它也就成为台湾民主化最坚实的一个后盾。那彭婉如事件呢，在1996年11月的时候，发生了震惊社会的彭婉如事件命案。彭婉如她原来是妇女新知基金会的秘书长，后来去担任民进党妇女部的主任。那当年妇女参政的保障名额就1/10。那彭婉如呢，她致力于去说服党内的同仁，能够通过在妇女这个参政的时候提名的这个名额呢，能够提供1/4的这个名额。所以呢，她在这个党员代表大会的时候，那积极去游说。那就在那一天呢，她游说完上了计程车要回到饭店的时候就失踪了。那3天之后发现呢，全身赤裸，身上被砍了35刀，到今天呢还没有破案。那也因为这样的一个事件呢，引起妇女团体非常非常的愤怒，所以强烈的诉求行政院要成立呢妇女权益促进委员会，那通过呢性侵害犯罪防治法、家庭暴力防治法，那要成立儿童局，同时呢教育部要成立两性平等委员会。那行政院呢竟然照单全收，所以呢让妇团的代表呢大家感到非常的难以置信。也从此以后，台湾的妇运从原来的在街上狗吠火车，一直到了现在可以进入到行政院开始做政策决策的一个参与。所以行政院呢成立了妇女权益促进委员会，由行政院长担任召集人，妇女团体的代表、专家学者，还有和各个部会的部长，大家共同来商讨妇女的政策。 那女权运动开始进入到国家的体制，那进而呢制定更多与性别权益有关的这些的法令。那到2012年的时候，台湾妇女团体全国联合会督促政府去签署消除对妇女一切形式歧视公约，简称为 CEDAW， 并予以呢内国法化。那由于台湾呢不是联合国的会员国，所以我们没有办法呢把这公约呢到联合国去存放，所以呢所撰写的这些的国家报告呢也没有办法送到联合国的 CEDAW 委员会里面呢去审查。因此，穷则变，变则通呢，我们就把 CEDAW 公约内国法化，同时呢，也为了宣示我们对公约的一个落实的一个坚持。因此，我们仍然呢遵从联合国的这个规定呢，我们让政府写国家报告，民间写影子报告。然后把联合国卸任的这些专家请到台湾来为我们的国家报告和影子报告做审查，并且提出建议。那作为我们行政院妇女政策的一个管考机制，那一步一步的去落实妇女的政策。所以我们才会有2000年第一次的我们的女性的副总统的诞生，2016年第一位的女性总统的诞生，也让台湾成为亚洲性别平等的一个典范。那上开女权运动的这些的策略呢，深深的影响了台湾的这个同志运动的崛起。所以呢，从1958年的时候就已经有女同志去扣关。1986年的时候，男同志祁家威也为了争取同性婚姻，那他也不断的锲而不舍。到了1998年的时候呢，同志团体那成立，那同时也不断的倡议。到了2003年开始呢，每年举办同志大游行。那2004年的时候，通过了性别平等教育法。到了2006年，民进党的这个立法委员萧美琴，也就是我们今天的副总统，他提出了同性婚姻法案，但是非常遗憾的，在立法院呢被杯葛了上千次。到了2012年的时候，我担任了民进党不分区的立委，我提出了民法亲属篇的修正案，让婚约由双方男女当事人订定，把男女删除，就是婚约由双方当事人订定，那承认同性婚约，并且呢，在立法院呢举办了第一次的同性婚姻法的公听会，让同性婚姻的议题能够被列入到国会的一个记录。法案呢，但是非常遗憾的，当时仍然是这个民进党仍然是少数党，所以被杯葛呢而胎死腹中。到2016年的时候，以自由民主、法治、人权为核心价值的民进党，在行政跟立法第一次政党轮替。所以呢，在第一次的政党轮替之后呢，而且台湾选出了第一位支持同婚法案的女性总统蔡英文。她同时呢提名了这个近半数的自由派的大法官。因此，从2016年开始，台湾呢历经了立法、释宪、公投、立法这样4个阶段呢，终于在2019年的5月24号呢，同性婚姻呢正式合法化，所以让台湾成为亚洲第一个同性婚姻合法化的国家。但是因为反同方的一个强烈的杯葛，同性婚姻呢，它就只能够订立专法，并不能够给予共同收养，也不能够给予跨国婚姻和人工生殖。所以同志团体仍然继续的奋斗，透过个案的诉讼，那继续的努力，终于呢，跨国同婚在2023年1月的时候，经由内政部的行政命令准予结婚登记。同时呢，在2023年，也就去年的5月的时候，我们立法院也立法通过可以共同收养。那同时呢，这个最富争议的两岸的同婚的议题呢，也在今年的9月刚刚呢，陆委会以行政命令呢，准许两岸的这个同志呢，他们能够在台湾办理结婚登记。所以呢，随着科技的一个发达进步，那网络的霸凌事件呢频传，网络的一个私密的影像的这个流传呢，恶意的散播， 厌女、丑女的言论呢，越来越变本加厉。那侵害隐私权的这些肉搜的这个猖獗，那真假讯息的这个夹杂的这样的一个恶意的攻击，那这个尤其呢这样的一个恶意攻击的这些言论呢，永远留存。那如何能够有遗忘权，把这些的恶意的言论呢，把它能够移除，这些等等呢，都侵害着人权的这些议题呢，方兴未艾。而且呢，它所造成的伤害呢，事实上是越演越烈，而且呢又非常的迅速，而且深远。那另外呢，诚如刚刚 Mary 教授所提到的，在国际之间各种的战争、气候变迁，事实上所受害的最大的受害者仍然是女性。所以这些等等的议题呢，都严格的考验着我们的智慧跟智能。所以这些呢，都有待我们再继续共同的努力。那以上跟我们的 Mary 教授还有大家分享，谢谢。
好，谢谢，非常谢谢。Let's hear from Professor Ye. Professor Ye is the University Chair Professor at the National Taiwan University College of Law. He is well known for his policy science approach to various law and policy issues, including constitutional change, environmental policy, and regulatory processes. He has authored an active main book and articles on constitutional law, environmental policy and law, sustainable development, and climate change. As if to demonstrate again the historical tie between education and politics, political year was moved time and again to serve the government, including serving as Minister without portfolio and Minister of the Research, Development, and Evaluation Commission in the early 2000s, and in more recently, the Minister of the Interior, and then the Minister of Education at a very critical juncture. He was elected a member and Secretary General of the National Assembly that approved constitutional amendment in 2005. Now, Professor Ye, please.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Wang, for your most kind note about me. Thank you so much. Professor Robinson, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I have greatest pleasure to sit beside Mary Robinson and also getting a chance to talk about. I would like to first respond to a question that is, how can we learn from Professor Robinson? With her high profile and also lots of work being done, and now we recognize her as the 2024 laureate of the Tang Prize in Rule of Law, I would like to propose 3 dimensions. One is humanity. I think Professor Robinson care about people, care about them, and value life and experience in a way that transcend into time and space. she is not confined by the place that she stands. Then maybe sometimes she stays in a family with 2 brothers and 4 brothers, with 2 elder and 2 junior, and she sits right in between. But she's not going to be confined by that position. She's not going to be confined by a family, by a society which is more conservative than we understand. She tried to benchmark the impossibilities. Beyond social constraint, if I may, even beyond personal constraint. She's not going to accept that enough. If she enjoys some sort of achievements, she's going to say, more to come, more to work on. There have been lots of failure, frustration in the trajectory of promoting human rights, and particularly gender equality. But that only serves as more food for further work. Number 2, I would like to say a lifelong work that is human rights and justice. And I would try to add one point that human rights is gender-centric. I think this is very, very special. Professor Robinson has been caring about gender issues since her earlier career up to now. But let's not stop her from expanding that to a broader human rights concern. So her work on human rights has touched upon all aspects of the human rights issue that we understand today. But at the same time, notwithstanding of that, I found a very rich and very strong attachment to the gender issue that she began with. As we know, that human rights issue could be so broad that we're almost fighting rights versus rights. And in some occasions, we may get lost in this wonderlands of rights advocacy. I found strong foundation of Professor Robinson's human rights advocacy that emphasize fundamental elements of gender, that is body. Sometimes it's inconvenient to talk about body, soul, and belief. Number 3, I would say representation. What Professor Robinson represents for. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of accompanying Professor Robinson in a press conference. And when reporter asked her about the structure of UN and how small country could have a full participation, and Professor Robinson answered, even I'm from Ireland. Ireland is not a big country. and we can still benchmark. As I said, that's impossible. Work hard, and you could be there. So I found that Professor Robinson has a very wide and sincere and workable representation based on humanity and rights conscious. Now, let me move to the core issue here, that is human rights. And I sense that from Professor Robinson's storytelling and the social context that she has been with, local, national, and international, I think there are three beyonds. Number one, human rights beyond text. We rarely heard that Professor Robinson citing these articles of the Constitution, that article, that text. She talked about lots of stories, lots of experience, lots of happenings, including that bank account situation. Nick, sorry for that, but that must be also your, heartfelt feeling that something happened to someone that I married during that period of time. So beyond text, and then beyond court, although Mary Robinson argued in front of the court, and even European Court of Human Rights for a couple of times. But her concern about human rights definitely in the court, and more importantly, beyond the court. This is extremely important, particularly for lawyers. Sometimes we may believe in order to gain progress in human rights, we need to revise the Constitution, we need to have a statute, we need to have legal basis. Before that, we can't get anything. Or, on the other hand, we also believe that any breakthrough is going to be coming from the court. So we always wait for the court to do something good for us, for human rights advancement. Professor Robinson's story tells us, no. We could go beyond court. Number three, the third beyond is beyond national borders. Human rights happen not from the sky. And definitely not like a shower, rain shower, to our national ground. Human rights is something that flows and being felt around the globe, not to mention implemented, articulated, discoursed around the globe. So I would say these three beyonds has been critical elements to understand Professor Robinson's work, particularly her work in the UN system. I had a chance to express my sincere sort of feeling to Professor Robinson. I thought this is wonderful. You work so hard in UN level. I myself, as a lawyer, sincere lawyer, also hope that I can work for UN, but with Taiwan's very limited representation. Maybe that's the dream for our next generation. But still, I admire and also value those human rights advocacy internationally so much because we are human beings. We happen to be born here, but we are all citizens also. As long as we begin to appreciate, value the human rights sufferings, and also human rights abuses beyond our national territory, then we really get the essence of human rights. Gender equality is a concern, but that gender equality also transcends into national borders. Like, for example, over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have lots of migrants from Southeast Asia that married to Taiwan. And that has a couple of 100,000, in number. Primarily, they are women. How to guarantee that they can live well and be accepted, even tolerated in our society? That is a big task for us. We spend lots of time working on that. And I myself feel so strongly this human rights concern is so global. And then let me move to my last concern. And I wonder whether I can have some dialogue, not particularly now, but in the future with Professor Robinson about it. I found nowadays human rights concern has changed dramatically. And that change has been systematic. Maybe I would say there are structural imbalance that we are facing today. I want to mention about war. War changed so much about our constitutional structure. Life is so important, but killing lives seems to be okay as long as we recognize this is a war. Lots of lives lost during the war. And we have different rules regarding to war. As long as we say we are engaged the war with you, we declare the war, it seems that one life is not one life. Thousands of lives are not counting on numbers. And that made me very uneasy, actually, particularly as shown by recent conflict in Ukraine and in Gaza. Nowadays, we are talking about who gained and who won the small war, who conquered this city or that city between Russia and Ukraine. But in the very beginning, we were troubled by how many were killed. Now we are talking about who is going to win the war. We have used to that. We have used to repeat that grammar of war. And that has been taken constitutionally or even in our constitutional international law that we human beings take it for granted. I know we have lots of humanitarians. They worry about this situation, and they begin to lament about what's going on right now. But it seems that we human beings, as we enter in this century, we are still powerless in dealing with this, not even from the perspective of human rights. This is one. And I want to mention the other fronts of the issue, and that is very policy-oriented that we are facing today. I will finish that in 3 minutes with that. Thank you. Let me say a little bit about climate change. It's something that we all concerned with. And nowadays, lots of countries is busy with so-called net zero. Some are not sincere, some are sincere. Even people are sincere, they don't care too much about that just transition. There are lots of human rights issues involved in the process. The disadvantaged that we care about gets more disadvantaged. The situation gets exacerbated because of extreme weather. But we see lots of discussion, lots of lip service to that. And Professor Robinson is working so seriously, everybody can, and try so hard to deal with that. And why this work is so painstaking? That is because of our pattern of development. Right now, even in Taiwan, we care about carbon rights. And can we trade? Do we have a business opportunity from that green economy? Have we ever identified the most vulnerable or fragile groups of extreme weather in Taiwan? Is that in our coastal area, or is that in our deep mountain? And what kind of business that they are doing, what kind of life that they are doing? Not to mention one very important element, that is loss and damage. As the UN is working on that, actually, whoever contributes to that, according to very simple compensation law, you need to pay for it. But those people who contributed to the current status never got a chance to pay that proportionately. Like, for example, Taiwan has contributed to about 1% of the carbon emission. Should Taiwan pay 1%? Of course, historically accumulated, carbon should do that. I'm done with this, and I think what I just said is about how Professor Robinson is so important and has manifest lots of angles on human rights that we need to learn, but also at the same time, how she is limited because we are facing a global world. And that may be like a big monster that all of us need to work together in order to deal with that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I have received instruction that we must end this forum by 4 o'clock. So we would do without the give and take, and I will give Madame Robinson the last word. And we had to do with that. Thank you. My apologies.
Well, thank you very much for kindly giving me the last word. I will try to make it a brief last word, but I do want to say just one or two things. I was lucky enough to have in advance the talk that Attorney Yu Mei Nu gave, and I heard the translation, but I also had time to think about it. And there are so many similarities with the way we had to work in Ireland to develop. I remember when I took the Norris case, it led to opening up to the same-sex marriage. It took time, but what was good was when we got the vote of the referendum, it wasn't a case of the city different from the rural areas. It was actually a very comprehensive yes to same-sex marriage. One county alone said no, and then got criticized. So it meant that in cities and in rural areas, in what was formerly a very Catholic-dominated country, people just thought they are entitled to love each other. They love each other. Why should they not marry? And this was the human rights dimension, which was very good. The second point, and I think this is broader than just for CEDAW, I have admired the way that Taiwan has been nuanced and clever about not being able to formally ratify, but nonetheless, whether it's in business and human rights or whether it's in CEDAW, tracking carefully, using the standards and abiding to those standards. And that's very clever. you know, it's the best you can do. And I want to admire very specifically that it is. And just one final point, very kind remarks from Professor Ye. I think we've got to know each other more closely than some others, and I do appreciate very much, but I also appreciated the way in which you said that war is very damaging to human rights at the moment because of the way the war, 2 wars, are being carried out. And 2 wars dominate: the Russian attack on Ukraine and the response of Israel to the terrible attacks of the 7th of October, but a disproportionate response. But also, we pay no attention to other very significant wars. The war in Sudan is causing such hardship, and it's almost hard to get people to focus now on the humanitarian situation, the human rights situation, the gender, the raping, the violence, and then the long running in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and always the role of countries outside and what they do in those countries. But it's the disrespect for human rights and the sense that some lives are much more important than others, which is completely contrary to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I would very much agree, these are tough times for human rights, for defense of human rights, for defense of international law, for defense of the UN system as a whole. But we've been through tough times before, and we must go through them and go through this one, which, again, I come back to the need for long view leadership of the elders as being, we have to learn again that the only way we will deal with major problems is through collaboration, through listening to each other, through working through the problems for the benefit of all. And so I have enjoyed this conversation, and I, in particular, will take away this very good paper on women's rights, and I appreciate that also very much. So thank you for giving me the last word. I hope I didn't exceed my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our forum today. But I would like to invite all our panelists to please stay on stage. And I also like to thank the audience in presence and our viewers worldwide. Without your presence here, without your participation, this forum wouldn't be such a great success. So thank you once again for your participation. Thank you.